June 6, 1944 began like any other day in Hitler's mountain retreat, yet it would become a day that changed the world forever. While the Führer slept, miles away along the Normandy coast, over 156,000 Allied soldiers were preparing to storm the beaches in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's supposedly impenetrable line of defense, stood ready, or so the High Command believed. But beneath the surface, confusion and fear had already begun to unravel the German command structure. From the early hours, the German generals faced a dilemma. Reports of unusual Allied activity had reached them, but with strict orders never to wake Hitler without absolute certainty, every decision became a gamble. The early warnings of airborne landings were dismissed by some as reconnaissance or feints, while others waited anxiously for instructions that would never come in time. Field Marshal Rommel, away in Germany, raced back in a desperate attempt to be at the front lines, but even his presence would not be enough to overcome the paralysis that gripped the German forces. Along the beaches, Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, sowing chaos and confusion. German units were scattered, roads were blocked, and the coordination necessary for a swift counterattack was impossible to achieve. German defenders, many exhausted and unsure of the scale of the invasion, believed the landings might be a diversion, a trick to draw forces away from the real target at Calais. This misjudgment would prove fatal. By mid-morning, reports began to filter in, but the rigid command structure delayed response. Tanks capable of counterattacking were held back 15 kilometers from the beaches. Generals debated, messengers ran back and forth, yet no decisive order emerged. For 9 crucial hours, the Atlantic Wall held, but only because of miscommunication, fear, and the belief that the true assault was still coming elsewhere. This delay allowed Allied troops to establish a foothold and turn the tide of the invasion from uncertainty into momentum. Inside command posts, tension grew. Officers whispered about phantom armies and reports of massive landings that might not exist. Every hour of hesitation compounded the crisis. The psychological strain on the German High Command was intense. They were acutely aware that every passing moment was a missed opportunity, yet protocol and fear of Hitler's wrath left them immobilized. Soldiers on the ground sensed this hesitation, and even in their terror, they began to exploit gaps that should never have existed. Meanwhile, Allied planners monitored the situation from headquarters, knowing that every hour the Germans remained paralyzed increased their chances of success. What could have been a catastrophic disaster for the Allies was instead a calculated victory, born not only of courage and planning, but also of the enemy's indecision. Small squads of engineers cleared obstacles under fire, medics tended to the wounded amidst chaos, and units pushed inland, gradually establishing control over key positions. Every movement was a testament to preparation meeting opportunity. Rumors spread quickly through German units. Some believed the Allies were testing the defenses, while others feared a massive encirclement. Conflicting orders created deadly bottlenecks as panzer divisions waited, engines idling just kilometers away. These tanks, fully capable of reversing the course of battle, remained stationary, their crews frustrated and confused. The delay was not just a failure of strategy, but a failure of leadership and trust. By the time clarity began to emerge, the window of decisive action had closed. The morning of June 6th is now remembered not only for the bravery of the soldiers who stormed the beaches, but also for the remarkable absence of decisive German leadership at the very moment it mattered most. The sleeping Führer, the hesitant generals, and the immobilized tanks would all play their part in transforming Normandy into the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It was a day when courage, deception, and fatal hesitation collided, setting the stage for the liberation of Europe and a permanent turning point in history. As the sun climbed higher over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the full scale of the Allied invasion began to sink in, yet the German High Command remained paralyzed. The morning's confusion had given way to a dangerous hesitation that would last 9 critical hours. Tanks and armored divisions, fully capable of striking back, sat idle just kilometers from the beaches. Messages were sent, received, and then delayed in a cycle of bureaucracy and fear. Every officer knew the stakes, yet no one dared act without Hitler's explicit command. And Hitler remained in his mountain retreat, convinced that Normandy might be a diversion designed to draw attention from the real landing at Calais. Field Marshal Rommel, who had spent months fortifying the Atlantic Wall, returned in a rush, only to find his carefully laid plans undone by indecision at the top. He had predicted the Allied landing, yet the rigid hierarchy and Hitler's obsessive control meant that even the best-laid German defenses could not be deployed in time. Rommel's presence, meant to inspire decisive action, instead revealed the depth of the paralysis gripping the Wehrmacht. Divisions that could have counterattacked were locked in place, awaiting orders that would never come quickly enough. The Allied deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, had worked flawlessly. German commanders were convinced that the main invasion force was still at Calais, over 150 miles away. Radio messages, double agents, and carefully staged maneuvers had created the illusion of a massive phantom army. This phantom force effectively immobilized 19 German divisions that might otherwise have turned the tide on Normandy's beaches. Every minute that these divisions remained in place widened the foothold the Allies were establishing on French soil. On the ground, the situation was chaotic. German soldiers were unsure whether to fight, retreat, or hold their positions. Officers shouted contradictory orders, adding to the confusion. Roads were clogged with vehicles and troops attempting to reposition themselves, while paratroopers behind enemy lines sabotaged communications and supply routes. The battlefield was a combination of bravery, miscommunication, and missed opportunities. Allied troops, aware of the delay in German response, pressed forward with methodical precision, consolidating their positions and reinforcing the beachheads. Inside German command posts, tension reached a breaking point. Generals debated strategy over maps that were constantly updated with incomplete or contradictory information. Some insisted on immediate counterattacks, while others feared invoking Hitler's wrath with unauthorized action. Every decision required courage, but fear of punishment and a rigid adherence to protocol prevented decisive movement. The psychological toll on these men was immense as they realized that hesitation could and would change the course of the war. The panzer divisions, poised and ready, represented a missed opportunity that would haunt the German command for the rest of the war. Engines idled as generals argued, and the clock ticked away precious hours. Reports came in from the front lines. The Allies had captured key positions, destroyed artillery emplacements, and pushed inland farther than anticipated. Still, the tanks remained stationary, a testament to the deadly combination of fear, misinformation, and rigid hierarchy. The commander's indecision had transformed a defensive operation into a slow-motion disaster. Meanwhile, Allied leaders observed the unfolding paralysis with a mix of relief and strategic focus. Every hour the Germans remained frozen allowed reinforcements to arrive and supply lines to be established. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire, medics attended to the wounded, and artillery units began to bring the enemy's positions under control. It was a textbook example of preparation meeting opportunity. The Allies understood that luck had played a role, but it was the German hesitation that had created the opening for a decisive victory. As the hours passed, Rommel and other commanders realized the full magnitude of the failure. Breakdowns in communications, conflicting intelligence reports, and the fear of defying Hitler meant that even with superior numbers and equipment, Germany's response was fragmented and ineffective. Orders delayed by protocol and uncertainty arrived too late to have any real impact on the battlefield. Soldiers on the front lines witnessed the consequences of High Command's paralysis firsthand, often improvising in the absence of clear instructions. The 9-hour delay would become a defining moment of D-Day, illustrating the lethal impact of indecision in warfare. What could have been a catastrophic setback for the Allies transformed into a turning point that allowed them to consolidate, push inland, and establish a permanent presence in Western Europe. It was a textbook example of preparation meeting opportunity. The Allies understood that luck had played a role, but it was the German hesitation that had created the opening for a decisive victory. By the late afternoon, the German High Command was forced to confront what had already happened. The divisions that had remained immobile could not change the outcome, and the window for an effective counterattack had closed. Normandy, once a defensive line, had become the beachhead for the liberation of Europe. The phantom armies, the delayed orders, and the immobilized tanks had all played their roles in a narrative that would be remembered as a testament to the consequences of indecision in the face of history's most critical moments. By the afternoon of June 6, 1944, the scale of the Allied invasion had become undeniable, yet German commanders were still trapped in a web of confusion and miscalculation. The first waves of troops had already secured beachheads, but reports from the front lines were contradictory and incomplete. Some units claimed that paratroopers had landed behind their positions, while others insisted the landings were merely feints. Radio traffic was jammed with conflicting intelligence, and German officers struggled to distinguish fact from rumor. Meanwhile, Hitler remained convinced that the main invasion force might be a diversion, and the true attack was still to come at Calais. This misjudgment would paralyze German decision-making during the hours when decisive action was most critical. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception plan, had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Fake radio transmissions, double agents, and even inflatable tanks created the illusion of a massive army poised to strike at Calais. German intelligence reports repeatedly confirmed this phantom threat, and 19 divisions remained frozen in place, unable to move because commanders feared they were being lured into a trap. This was not a simple error, it was a carefully orchestrated psychological tactic that exploited the German command's own fears and rigid hierarchy. Every hour these divisions stayed idle, the Allies gained ground on Normandy's beaches, reinforcing positions and securing critical supply routes. On the beaches themselves, chaos met meticulous planning. Allied forces faced intense resistance, yet the hesitation of German armored units allowed small squads to advance further than they might have under direct counterattacks. Engineers cleared obstacles under enemy fire, artillery provided covering support, and medics tended to the wounded amidst ongoing assaults. Every movement reflected careful coordination, but it was amplified by the enemy's indecision. The Germans had the tools, the manpower, and the knowledge to push the Allies back into the sea, yet their response remained fragmented and inconsistent. Inside command posts, tension reached a near breaking point. Generals pored over maps, updating positions, calculating movements, and arguing over strategy. Orders were sent, amended, and often delayed by bureaucratic procedures. Some officers urged immediate counterattacks, while others hesitated, fearing they would invoke Hitler's wrath by acting without authorization. The fear of punishment and a rigid adherence to hierarchy created a deadly bottleneck. By the time clarity began to emerge, the battlefield had already shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The failure of German intelligence during the early hours of the invasion became painfully evident. Reconnaissance reports were misinterpreted, sightings of enemy units were dismissed as diversions, and warnings from field officers were delayed or ignored. This was not merely a failure of information, it was a failure of trust, coordination, and psychological resilience. Commanders were paralyzed by the belief that any premature action could lead to disaster, Yet inaction itself was creating catastrophe. Tanks and mechanized units capable of striking with devastating effect remained idle, engines running as precious minutes slipped away. Meanwhile, Allied leaders monitored every development with a mix of anxiety and strategic focus. They understood the risks, but they also recognized the advantages created by the enemy's hesitation. Every hour the Germans remained frozen allowed reinforcements to arrive, supply chains to be secured, and artillery positions to be strengthened. Soldiers advanced inland, consolidating gains and exploiting weaknesses that only existed because of German inaction. The success of the beach landings was as much a product of courage and planning as it was of enemy indecision. Rumors among German units further compounded the chaos. Some soldiers believed they were under attack from forces far larger than reality, while others feared that retreating would expose them to encirclement. Contradictory orders led to confusion on the ground. Roads became clogged with vehicles attempting to reposition, while communication lines faltered under constant bombardment. Every small error multiplied, creating a cascading failure that no single officer could control. The battlefield became a maze of indecision, fear, and missed opportunities. By late afternoon, the true scale of the Allied assault was impossible to ignore. The divisions that had remained in place, immobilized by fear and deception, could not change the outcome. German high command began to realize that their inaction had allowed the Allies to achieve what many had predicted would be impossible. The combination of Operation Fortitude's deception, conflicting intelligence, and rigid hierarchy had effectively neutralized Germany's ability to respond. Normandy was no longer just a landing, it had become the springboard for the liberation of Western Europe. The events of this chapter of D-Day illustrate the lethal consequences of miscalculation, indecision, and psychological manipulation. What could have been a swift German counterattack turned into a prolonged crisis, giving the Allies time, space, and momentum. Every hour of hesitation had real consequences on the ground, and every misinterpreted report magnified the confusion. By the time the Germans began to act, the window for reversing the invasion had long passed, and the battlefield had already shifted irreversibly. It was a moment where courage, deception, and failure collided, demonstrating that in war, the mind can be as decisive as the weapons in hand.
By late afternoon on June 6, 1944, the reality of Normandy's invasion had fully hit the German High Command. Field Marshal Rommel, who had spent months strengthening the Atlantic Wall, now realized that even his careful planning could not overcome the paralysis that gripped the Wehrmacht. Orders that could have mobilized panzer divisions were delayed or blocked by fear of Hitler's reaction, bureaucratic procedures, and conflicting intelligence reports. For hours, Germany's strongest armored units remained stationary, engines idling just kilometers from the front lines, their crews acutely aware that they had the power to change the course of the battle, yet forbidden to act. Rommel understood the stakes better than most. He had warned of the likelihood of an Allied landing in Normandy, emphasizing the need for flexible, mobile responses. Now, as reports flooded in from the front, he realized that hesitation had given the Allies a crucial foothold. The phantom armies at Calais, an illusion carefully maintained by Allied deception operations, had immobilized 19 German divisions. These forces, which could have struck at the invading troops during the most vulnerable moments, were instead frozen by fear, uncertainty, and the illusion of a greater threat. Rommel's worst predictions were coming true. Inside German command posts, panic and indecision intensified. Officers argued over strategy, sometimes shouting over maps as reports arrived from multiple fronts. Reconnaissance sightings were interpreted in conflicting ways, creating an endless cycle of debate and delay. Some generals pushed for immediate counterattacks, believing that speed was essential, while others argued that acting without Hitler's approval would be catastrophic. This tension between initiative and obedience created a lethal bottleneck that would determine the fate of the invasion. On the beaches and inland, Allied troops exploited every gap in the German response. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire, artillery and mortars suppressed German defensive positions, and infantry pressed inland, steadily expanding the beachheads. Every small advance was magnified by the enemy's inability to react. Soldiers who had trained for months faced fierce resistance, yet the hesitation of German armored units gave them just enough breathing room to establish positions that would later serve as springboards for further operations. Meanwhile, Rommel tried to influence the command chain, pressing for decisive action. His words reflected both urgency and frustration. Reports suggest that he repeatedly emphasized the need for mobile armored counterattacks, warning that delay would allow the Allies to consolidate and strengthen their positions. Yet, despite his authority and experience, Rommel's influence was limited by the rigid hierarchy of the German military and the obsession with Hitler's direct control. Even the most capable leaders found themselves powerless when the system demanded compliance over initiative. The psychological strain on German commanders was palpable. Many understood that the invasion represented a turning point, that Normandy was not just another landing but the opening of a Western front that could ultimately liberate Europe. Yet fear, miscommunication, and misinformation prevented them from acting decisively. Panzer divisions poised to strike remained in place, while reports from frontline commanders highlighted gaps and weaknesses that could have been exploited. Every hour of inaction deepened the sense of crisis, and every misinterpreted order amplified the chaos. Back at Allied headquarters, Eisenhower and his staff monitored the unfolding situation with cautious optimism. Every hour the Germans remained immobilized increased the chances of success, and each gap on the battlefield presented an opportunity to secure critical objectives. The meticulous planning of the Allied invasion, combined with the enemy's paralysis, created a rare convergence of preparation and circumstance. The soldiers on the ground, though facing fierce resistance, moved with determination and precision, turning hesitation into momentum. As evening approached, the scale of German failure became undeniable. The armored divisions that could have struck decisively remained unable to act. Rommel, witnessing the consequences of hesitation firsthand, recognized that the strategic window for an effective counterattack had closed. German forces, despite their superior numbers and equipment, had been paralyzed by fear, miscommunication, and deception. The battle for Normandy was no longer just a defensive effort. It had become the beginning of a Western advance that would ultimately liberate Europe. These events of this day highlight the critical importance of leadership, initiative, and decision-making in warfare. Rommel's warnings, the High Command's hesitation, and the Allied use of deception combined to create a situation where courage and planning on one side met indecision and fear on the other. The failure to act decisively during the most crucial hours of D-Day transformed what could have been a German counterattack into a historical turning point, demonstrating that in war, timing and psychological readiness can be just as decisive as weapons or numbers. By nightfall, the German High Command was forced to confront the reality of their failures. The divisions that had remained stationary could not undo what had already been set in motion. Normandy had become the springboard for liberation, and the consequences of indecision would be remembered as a defining lesson in military history. It was a day when strategy, courage, and hesitation collided, and the balance of power in Europe began to shift irreversibly.
By the evening of June 6, 1944, the full impact of the Allied invasion had become clear. Normandy was no longer a distant objective or a potential feint. It had become the foundation for the liberation of Western Europe. The Allies had secured multiple beachheads, established supply lines, and begun to push inland, all while German forces remained fragmented, hesitant, and disoriented. What had been a meticulously planned operation was now transforming into a strategic reality, accelerated not only by courage and coordination, but by the enemy's extraordinary failures. German commanders faced the sobering truth that their hesitation during the first 9 critical hours had irreversibly altered the course of the battle. Panzer divisions, capable of delivering decisive counterattacks, had remained immobilized. Misinformation, conflicting intelligence reports, and the fear of Hitler's reprisal had created a paralysis that no amount of planning could overcome. The phantom armies at Calais, The delayed orders and the rigid command structure had combined to render Germany unable to act effectively at the moment it mattered most. Each hour of inaction had been seized by the Allies, turning potential catastrophe into opportunity. Soldiers on the beaches and inland were exhausted, yet their discipline and training allowed them to capitalize on every German misstep. Engineers continued to clear obstacles and mines, artillery units provided precise cover, and infantry pressed forward against entrenched defenses. The delay of German armored divisions meant that resistance was less coordinated, allowing Allied forces to secure key positions and expand their foothold. Every gain was hard-won, but it was made possible in part because of hesitation and misjudgment on the German side. In the command posts, German generals began to acknowledge the scale of their failure. Reports indicated that the divisions kept at Calais could not arrive in time, and those in Normandy had acted too late. Communications that had been slow, fragmented, or ignored now highlighted the devastating consequences of inaction. Psychological strain was evident. The men responsible for critical decisions were forced to confront the reality that their rigidity and fear had allowed the enemy to gain the upper hand. This realization, as chilling as any battlefield loss, would haunt them for the remainder of the war. The consequences of D-Day extended beyond the immediate military situation. The Allied invasion forced a permanent Western front, diverting German resources and attention from other critical areas. It exposed weaknesses in command, strategy, and intelligence that would continue to affect the German war effort. Historians now view these hours not just as a moment of tactical success, but as a lesson in the catastrophic impact of indecision under pressure. The ability to act decisively, to trust judgment, and to adapt quickly to changing circumstances had proven more important than numerical superiority or advanced weaponry. Back with the Allies, planners and commanders understood that their success had been facilitated not only by skill, but by circumstances created through enemy error. Every logistical decision, every tactical maneuver, and every act of bravery on the ground was amplified by the German paralysis. Supply lines were secured, bridges and roads cleared, and units began to push further inland. Allied forces were no longer constrained to the beaches. Normandy was now a staging ground for an advance that would eventually reach the heart of occupied Europe. Post-war testimonies from German generals at Nuremberg revealed their profound awareness of these critical failures. Many admitted that the delay, the miscommunication, and the fear of taking initiative had sealed the fate of Germany on the Western Front. The Phantom Army at Calais, the rigid adherence to protocol, and the obsession with Hitler's approval had combined to produce a command structure unable to respond in real time to the most pivotal battle of the war. These admissions highlighted the extraordinary human and organizational factors that contributed to D-Day's success. The events of this day serve as a stark reminder that history is shaped not only by courage and planning, but also by hesitation and error. While the Allied soldiers secured the beaches and inland positions, it was the failure of German high command to act decisively that ensured those gains would not be reversed. Normandy became a turning point, demonstrating how moments of paralysis in leadership can have consequences far beyond the battlefield. By nightfall, the tide had fully turned. The divisions that might have struck decisively were immobile. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the Allies had established a foothold that would lead to the liberation of France and ultimately the defeat of Nazi Germany. The lessons of D-Day are as clear as they are profound. Hesitation, fear, and miscommunication in leadership can be as destructive as enemy fire, and moments of decisive action can change the course of history forever. The liberation of Normandy was more than a military achievement. It was a testament to the convergence of planning, courage, and opportunity, and a reminder that in war, as in life, indecision can be as lethal as any weapon. It was the day when mistakes, misperceptions, and psychological paralysis collided with bravery and preparation, creating a moment that would forever alter the course of the 20th century.